morning. Welcome to this week's video. It is Weathering Models 101. This is a basic introductory session. Evan is our guest, and he will be talking about the basic principles, or I should say current principles of weathering, involving a lot of the new products and techniques that are on the market. We were having a little chat earlier, and I was talking about my old schooly stuff, dry brushing with steel on your tanks and using some graphite from your pencil to highlight things. And, washes were a big thing. You just slap those babies on. And now we have washes for every type of dirt in every part of the world. You could probably get Antarctic moss or something if you really wanted it. But there's a big range of products. They all have their own uses. Some are better than others. And Evan's tried them all. So he's going to walk you through a lot of the current techniques, and then you can make a decision on how you'd like to approach weathering on your models. He is going to do real basics here. It's kind of an introduction. You want a deep dive on this, I recommend highly you go to his YouTube channel, Panzermeister 36. He's been running that thing for years, and he's got a lot of really useful information on there. So this is to get you started, but when you want to go all in, go to the man's YouTube channel. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you. So as Bill was saying, I want to do a more basic overall look at a lot of products out there in the market, because if you're new to the hobby or returning to the hobby, this can be quite intimidating. You go to the hobby store, look at all the stuff, and there's like all these different brands, all these different bottles, and a lot of them are very similar. So I want to kind of go over that and talk about some techniques and some products that you can use for each technique, because a lot of them are the same. So let's say you've got your model where you've painted it with the base paints. Maybe you've applied the decals and you've detail painted maybe the tools or whatever other accessories you've got on the model there. The next step is you're basically going to start the weathering effects. Generally, I will start with chipping effects because I like to do all my acrylics at the same time, essentially. So the base painting is acrylics, the detail painting tools and stuff is acrylics. I'll then paint my chipping effects, and then afterwards I'll move on to the washes and everything else. So for chipping effects, I like to use acrylic paints, mainly these AK third generation acrylics. I really like these, but you can also use Vallejo or MIG Ammo or all these other brands. The bottles all look the same essentially, and they're all very similar. And for chipping effects, I like to use a two-color approach where I will first create some scratches with a lighter version of the base color. So for example, if your model's gray, I'll pick something that's like a lighter gray, and I'll paint some little scratches and everything like that. And then I'll go in with a second color, which usually looks good if it's either like a red primer color or a dark brown. So model color, German camouflage, black brown is one of my favorites. Also AK saddle brown is nice. It's all personal preference. And I'll use this to make some deeper damage in a few areas. So heavier chipping areas around the hatches, I'll do a little bit of this, but mostly I keep it the light scratches because that looks good. And if you do this everywhere with the red or the brown, it gets out of hand really fast. So again, a lighter version of the base color for first scratches. So that could be light gray on this. If you have a turret, or a vehicle that's green, like this turret, for example, I've already done a little bit of the light green. You might be able to see kind of on the corner there. And then if your tank is yellow, well, then I'll use a light yellow, like this is Vampiric Flesh, which I actually really like for chipping on the yellow tanks. And then, like I said, you'll go in with a brown or a red primer. Another strategy, which is a little bit more old school, as Bill was saying, but is still applicable, is to do dry brushing. And that is, you're basically doing the same thing. You're making like some wear on the edges and so on, but you're doing it a little bit more quick and dirty, I'd say. So you could pick your lighter version of the base color, same thing, lighter gray, lighter green, lighter yellow, and then you would use a softer brush like this, a softer large brush, and then you get a little bit of paint on it, and then you can use a paper towel and unload as much as you possibly can, essentially. So it's just a little hint of paint in there still. Then you can lightly just kind of go over the model, and it'll catch on all the raised edges, and that is a nice way to simulate wear and tear, and also gives it like a highlight effect to make the details pop out a little bit. I don't do that very much, but it has its place, especially if there's a model with a lot of rivets on it. You can do that, or do it precisely on each rivet if you have lots of time. Go in there and one by one do each rivet. But the effect is the same. You're making highlights and scratches, or the effect of that on raised details. So that kind of covers the acrylic weathering stages. It's pretty straightforward, just chipping and scratches and so on, essentially making the model look damaged and more like metal. It adds interest to the model. So my example here is this model is pretty close to being done, but if I get it in the camera here, you can see I've done little scratches and everything around the hatches with a lighter yellow. In a few areas, a good example might be right here where this gun cover slides back and forth. There's a little bit of red primer there if you can see that. Hopefully you can see that. So after I've done my acrylic weathering and also all the previous acrylic painting, decals and everything, I will then go in and I like to seal the model with a varnish before doing any of the next effects for two reasons. First of all, you want a smoother finish for all of these things to flow around a little bit easier. If the model is matte, as it generally is after all the painting, the surface is really like rough and weathering can kind of get in there and it's hard to adjust it and move it around. So I like a smoother finish. Also, I like to protect the previous paints because some brands of paint can be very fragile and the thinners used in a lot of these washes and stuff can sometimes damage the paint. So I like to use a satin varnish. Some people like to use a gloss. It's all personal preference. So for gloss, I like Tamiya X22 Clear. I thin it down with lacquer thinner, airbrush it on. Or you can use any other gloss you like Future if that's your preference and so on. Personally, I prefer the satin, which is kind of halfway between the smooth and the rough. I find this gives a nice texture so the weathering still sticks a little bit, but it can be moved around and still smooth and it flows and everything. So I airbrush this on to prepare for all the following weathering effects. Again, personal preference, you can use a gloss as you did for your decals, or you can use satin if that's your style. And then we get on to all the rest of the weathering effects, and this is where probably a lot of those confusing brands and different, all these different bottles come into play. And if you're new, it's probably overwhelming, but a lot of it is kind of the same, just different colors, essentially. So the first thing you might think about doing, or you might see the products for, is a filter. So I've got some examples here. I've got a MIG Ammo filter, and I've got a MIG Productions, which is a different company, filter. Essentially, these are just really, really, really thin down enamel paints. And the objective of these is usually twofold. First of all, you can add a corrective tint to the model if you've painted it and you don't like the color too much. So one example, which is kind of like, the new hot thing or whatever, is to do a blue filter on your Panzer Gray, like this example here. You could use it with this, you could do this blue for Panzer Gray filter. Or another example is you make it yourself by thinning down some oil paint, just like 90% paint, 20% thinner, and you just apply it over the whole surface, and it gives a little bit of a tint. Now, I don't do that because you can just mix some of that color into the paint when you airbrush it in the first place, and you get the same effect. So this is never required. This is entirely optional, and I don't really use these at all because, it's just kind of like a waste of time almost. I'll just paint the model the right color I want when I paint it. So these products, I don't really use them too much. If you're new to the hobby, I don't think you need to get into filters right away. It's kind of a more advanced thing, maybe. Another technique that people talk about is a dot filter, which is different than a filter. That is where you will use a bunch of dots of oil paint, apply them on the model, and then you streak it with a soft brush, kind of like this. And you're basically just making streaking effects on the model with that. So you can use these oil paints. You can also go out and buy a fancy streaking grime pre-mixed for you in the bottle. The effect in the end is the same. These are all used for streaking effects. So you have options. Here's a dust streaking effect kind of thing. Again, you're doing the same technique, but you've got different options. You can do it yourself with oil paints. You can buy the pre-mixed thing. You're just making streaking effects in the end. I should point out a key thing here is you have to use oil paints, not acrylic paints, because these dry too fast, so you can't really streak them nicely. They'll dry on the model before you can blend them properly. So the slow drying oil paints are generally preferred here, or the enamel pre-mixed washes are the same thing, really. You can also apply a wash to the model, which I think is a good idea. I would recommend a wash as almost a required weathering technique. Even if the model's supposed to be very clean, a wash can still make it look more realistic without necessarily making it look dirty and weathered. So some of these effects, like I was talking about, filters and dot filters, you don't really need them. It's all preference, but I really would recommend a wash if you're doing any weathering on the model. Again, you have options here. You've got pre-mixed washes that you can buy from different brands. Again, I've got the MIG Ammo here. I've got the MIG Productions. Again, somehow a different company. And I've got also my own, well, you can mix your own oil paints. So I've got dark brown and dark gray here. You thin these down a bunch in a cup with thinner, and you just make your own thinned down wash. Generally for this, you would want to use a dark brown or a dark gray because the objective is to simulate shadows. So I've got an example here on this turret. I've applied a wash, and you can probably see how the shadows around, you know, for example, those little springs there and everything else on the turret, all the details, they're all kind of surrounded by a little shadow, and that's a very dark brown oil paint. Again, this is one of the reasons why I recommend putting that varnish on beforehand, like for example this, because this gives a smoother finish, and then when you're applying little bits of that wash, it'll flow and collect around the details, which is where you want the shadows to be. So, like I said before, I really recommend a wash if you're going to do any weathering effect at all, because it doesn't have to make the model look dirty and grimy. It can just make it look larger than life by making the details pop out by adding these shadows around them. Kind of the opposite of the dry brushing or highlighting earlier with a lighter color, which makes highlights. This will make shadows around all the details, and it makes them pop out. So we've kind of covered most of the weathering effects you'd apply on the upper surface. We've done the filter, streaking effects, and the washes, and also the chipping effects. As I've been saying, a lot of this is optional, but chipping effects and washes is pretty standard for like, you know, required weathering effects, if you can call it that. Nothing's required. It's all whatever you want to do on your model. The last effects we'll get into are going to be things like the lower hull weathering effects. On the lower hull, you're going to want to apply usually dust and mud effects to varying degrees. And as I've been saying, a lot of the stuff is the same. What you're going to use is washes and streaking effects, really, which is no different than what you did on the top of the model. So some examples of products you can use there are, surprise, more oil paints, just different colors. Now I'm going to use browns and grays instead of, like, you know, maybe some lighter colors for streaks or rain marks. I like Starship Filth is a good color, a nice dark brown. Dust is also a good color for dust, of course. I've also got dust from a different company, which is a little bit different color, but these all work together to make variations in the dust effects. Or for an example, you can also buy your own, or buy your hobby shop's, you know, local, or whatever brand they have in the local shop, essentially. These are just washes, but they're a little bit thicker, and they're just brown. So you apply them on the lower hull, and you can make streaking effects with them, or you can make them collect around the crevices where the mud would most likely collect. And same effect as really on the upper areas, but now you're simulating mud and dirt and everything else on the lower hull areas. Some of these effects you might see at the store are a little bit different. Like these are some examples. This is a texture enamel, so it's really similar to these, just with more texture in it. And these ones here are actually acrylic, so they're water-based, but they do the same job. They're just more texture, so you can build up some larger collections of mud and crevices. This one has grass built into it, so you can apply it and it simulates built-up grass. But, I mean, they're all the same in the end, right? Just whatever brand you prefer, or whatever brand's the cheapest, or whatever brand's in your local store, go with that, and your model's going to look pretty much the same in the end, honestly. The last thing I'll mention here is pigments. Now, pigments are kind of coming out of fashion now because they can be unreliable. I'm sure people who have tried it have experienced you apply pigments on your model, and then you apply a varnish and they just like disappear. And you're like, where'd all my weathering go? They get blown away or whatever, and it's not really fun. So I have some examples of pigments here. You can still use these, but I recommend either you can mix them into one of the mud washes you apply, and it kind of gives it some texture. It also helps to glue it on so it doesn't disappear when you apply a varnish. But typical brands would be something like the MIG Ammo or the AK Interactive, or again, MIG Productions. This Wilder stuff is out of production, but it's all the same thing, just different brands, right? It's just a little powder. Some people grind up their own pastels to make their own. I'm fine with these, but they work pretty well. I use them occasionally. It's hard to sometimes simulate dust effects without using actual pigments. Some of these washes, they can be a little unconvincing sometimes. Even though it's supposed to simulate dust, it might not have the right like powdery texture. So select use of the pigments can be beneficial. Also, you can buy rust pigments to make rust on exhausts and everything like that. So that's kind of the basics of weathering. Like I've been saying, a lot of this is optional. If you're going to do any weathering on your model, I would recommend you can do some chipping or dry brushing. That's pretty straightforward and easy. Makes nice highlights and makes damage and interest in the model. Then you can apply the varnish to make the surface smooth and protect it. Then for sure a wash is good for doing the opposite, making shadows. And depending on how you apply it, you can also simulate some dirt and everything else on the upper surfaces. And I just think a wash always makes the model look better than it did before the wash. It always makes details pop out and everything looks so much more defined. And then you have all these filters and stuff, which honestly I don't really bother with a lot of the time, but you can try them if you want. And then at the end, you're going to apply the dirt and mud effects, which is similar to washes, but you might go with something with a little bit more texture if that's to your liking. Again, these brands are all very interchangeable because they're mostly the same, just different labels, different companies. One last thing I should mention is when you're working with these enamel washes or the oil paints, you need an enamel-based thinner. You can't use the same thinner you used for your acrylic paints. So examples of that, I've got a few here. You've got the MIG Productions thinner, MIG Ammo thinner, and AK Interactive, the three big brands. And they're all basically the same thing, right? You can even use lighter fluid, like Zippo lighter fluid. You can use that. It's probably cheaper. It's supposed to work exactly the same way. And you can also probably buy something in the hardware store if you want to be a little bit more dangerous, but maybe save some money. I don't know. But then, again, this is all the same thing, just different bottles. And these thinners are what you need for the washes and oil paints. And then for, of course, the acrylics you applied for the chipping. These are water-based, so water is good for them. Or some other thinner. This is a retarder or whatever. So hopefully that has explained a lot of the basics without being too confusing. I'm trying to keep it relatively straightforward by explaining different techniques and the products for each one. I guess maybe I'll show this model off a little bit and I can point out certain effects and then we'll go into a demonstration. So here's my Jagdpanzer IV. Like I've pointed out, I've done some chipping effects on the upper areas here. I've also used some built up, like a little bit of dust effects, maybe some grime around the hatches or other corners where it might collect. You can also see dirt effects on the lower hull. It's collecting nicely in that Zimmerit pattern. And I've also done a little bit of chipping, as I pointed out before. Some highlighting, like you might get with dry brushing, is visible with the bolts on the spare wheel there, and also all the bolts along the engine deck. Makes those details pop out, along with the wash I apply around them. I did use some pigments for the rust on the spare tracks on the back there. That's an example of where I would use pigments, though I avoid them because they can be unreliable sometimes. You don't want your weathering to disappear when you apply the final clear coat at the end. And I didn't really do any filtering on this model because, like I said, kind of useless. But I did use a little bit of the oil paints, kind of like a dot filter effect, to make some variation on these areas. So this isn't just green. This is green with a couple of other colors. I think when I mentioned the filter earlier on, I said its points are twofold, and I think I forgot to mention one of them. Like I said, you can make variation, or sorry, you can make a blue tint on your model, as you might on this one. Another effect of the filter is it can help to blend the camouflage colors together a little bit. And that's visible on this model where the green isn't too stark versus the base yellow. By playing with some oil paints there and making like a dot filter, I've blended them a little bit to make the model look more unified and cohesive. Otherwise, your camouflage can sometimes have too much contrast. And of course, the weathering and the filtering and all that washing and stuff can help to make the markings blend into the finish. Otherwise, the decals, when you first apply them, might have too much contrast. All right, let's move on to the demonstration. So I'm going to do some demonstrations on this little turret here, for example. You can see I've already applied a varnish, actually. That's why half of it's shiny. We'll do washes there in a minute. I'm going to do the chipping effects or some dry brushing on the rear surface here. So I've got two colors here. I've got green and yellow, which might be some common colors on your military models. And for that example, I've got some green and some yellow paints here for my highlight or the dry brushing or whatever chipping effect you're going to go for. I've also got some brown and some red here for the depth of the chipping effect. I've got some tap water just to thin the paints down. You could also use some of the retarder if you need to make the paints last a little bit longer. Otherwise, they might dry up on your palette too quickly if you're doing the whole model. So as I've been saying, the chipping effects are mainly used to make some highlights and also simulate some damage. So if we pretend these are hatches where the crew might be walking in and out of the vehicle, you would probably want to have chipping effects around the hatches where the crew is obviously going in and out and also handling the hatch to get in and out. So I'd make some chipping effects, along the raised edges here. I'm going to do this a little quick and dirty, but you can be more precise if you're doing it on your actual model you care about. Hopefully that is visible. I've done some little chipping here. I might mix that with white just to make it more visible. So my yellow isn't light enough for my taste, so I'm going to add a little bit of white just to make it a lighter highlight color on the chipping effects. And it'll show better on camera for that way. All right. So I'll paint the chipping effects around the edges of the hatch where there would be wear and tear from the crew going in and out and other, there, you can see that now for sure, other access of the vehicle. Raised edges as well. These will catch damage and people walking around. There's also a little edge right here, so I might kind of highlight that a little bit. I did a bit of a crappy job there, but it serves the purpose. You can also use a piece of sponge and carefully get a little bit of paint on the sponge and just tap it to the edges. And the texture of the sponge will also make a nice chipping pattern as well. I find that works really well on the raised edges because it'll catch it. Not so well on the flat areas where you almost just make a stamp of the sponge. So on the flat edges, I'll carefully apply it with some scratches and scrapes with a paintbrush like this. Ooh, not like that. There we go. I'll make some scratches and chips here. And then after I've done my highlight, I will then use a little bit of the color for some depth, which could be the red primer color or the dark brown. Come on. And we can make some depth to the chipping effect where the paint maybe has chipped through and revealed primer or rust or something underneath, whatever you want to simulate here. Maybe that'll show up on the camera there a little bit. You don't want to do too much of the red primer effect because it can get out of hand really quick. So I usually leave most of the chipping effects as just the highlight scratch color. We can do the same thing on the green area, but I might try some dry brushing there just to show you how you can do this a little bit more quick and dirty if you're new to the hobby. I don't do much dry brushing, so hopefully I do a good job here. So I get some paint on my paintbrush. I wipe off as much of it as I can, so I just have the barest little hint. And then we can just try to catch the edges. Yeah, that's all right. That's better. I'm not too experienced with this, honestly. It's a bit of a... People see this as old school, but now they're bringing it back to sell you more convenience products and bottles. But even just doing something like that can create some chipping effects or some highlights on the raised edges there. You can do that over the whole model. You can get a larger, softer brush and just kind of go at it if you want. That's how I've seen some people do it. And with experience, you can do a good job with anything, really. Now for some washes, I'll do that on the front half here. As I said before, we've already got the varnish on there. That's why it's nice and shiny, because that surface will help us blend the paint, and it'll flow nicely and stay around the crevices where you want to have the shadows. So again, you do that after the chipping effects have all been completed. Alrighty. Got some enamel thinner here. What should we use? I've got Africa Core wash for Africa vehicles only. That'll work. Usually a brown wash looks good on the yellow surface. On the darker green, I would use usually a very dark brown or a dark gray. If you use a lighter brown on the green, it just kind of looks like rust. It doesn't really give you a nice shadow effect. But this Africa Core wash is perfect for a lighter color. I'm just going to get some out of here. That'll work. So you can see how it's already like a super thin mixture of paint in the bottle. It's mostly just thinner, but of course there's that brown paint in there too. This is a convenience product, as we say, because it's convenient to pour it right out of the bottle, and it's perfect as it is. But you can also just buy your own oil paint and thinner, thin it down a bunch, and make yourself your own wash. That's cheaper, and that's what a lot of people like to do. So with my wash here, we'll try to make some shadows around the rivets and other details on the turret. I need more thinner on that. So as I tap to these little bolts, hopefully you can see that the paint is just kind of flowing around them. I just touch the paint to the rivet there, and it'll flow around the whole thing on its own. That's because we have that varnish applied beforehand. There we go. That looks pretty good already. That's pretty quick and dirty, but you can see how all those little details are popping out a whole bunch more. Now you can also go for a more overall wash style. Some people will do that where they'll just use a larger brush and they'll apply it kind of over the whole surface like that. And then you might use a cotton bud or something to wipe it away from the flat area, leaving it only in the crevice afterwards. It's a different style, but you're really getting the same effect in the end. I guess I can kind of do that now by just wiping it away. Now you do something like this and you might have, you're still getting that shadow effect, but that's a lot more of a overall nice and easy effect there. That might be called a wash, while what I was doing is usually called a pin wash because it's more precise. It's all the same thing in the end though, right? Exactly.
Change the whole tonality of that panel.
Exactly. That's like I've been saying, it's all the same thing in the end, right? You're all using the same products. A filter that you would buy is just a super thin wash essentially, and you would apply it to do the same effect as that. Let's see what we can do next. Maybe we could do some dot filters. Sure. Or some kind of effect like that, some streaking effects. I'll get some dirt colored oil paints. I'll put them out on my paper. Now for oil paints, you can buy artist oil paints at the store, and they're a little bit cheaper. I like the Winton brand if you're going with that. Winsor & Newton Winton. But if you're going to do that, you definitely want to leave the paint out. Like I've applied it here on my paper towel or a piece of cardboard. You want to leave the blob of paint out there for a few hours, like 5 or 6 hours, because that can help soak out a bunch of the linseed oil, and it will dry a lot faster on the model. I'm not exactly sure of the chemistry why, but I believe that on like when a painter's painting, of course, their canvas or their wood, whatever that they're painting on, will absorb that eventually and dry the paint. The plastic model isn't going to absorb any of it. It's a sealed plastic surface, so you have to kind of get some of that oil out of the oil paint so it dries a little bit faster. But these modeling oil paints, the 502 Abteilung and the MIG Ammo oil brusher, they seem to dry pretty quick, so I don't really bother with that too much. So we'll make some streaking effects somewhere on this turret if I can find a nice spot. Have a smooth surface. We'll just figure it out. I'll do it over here. So I'm going to do some streaking effects here. You would also do this on the lower hull areas of the vehicle to simulate the dirt and the mud and everything. So I could take a little bit of my brown oil paint. You can apply little dots of it as a dot filter, or you can be more precise and kind of paint accumulations of dirt and dust in corners, and then blend this out. So I'm going to put a bunch in that crevice there, and maybe I'll do some dust as well. Do some dots of the dust. You can see my little dots of paint there. And we'll also do maybe some dust accumulations on this panel. As I said earlier, the use of the oil paint here is key, because if I did acrylic paints, that would be drying pretty quick and it would just look like that and it wouldn't be very impressive, would it? But these oil paints dry over the course of many hours. So you can wait a little while and then blend it out. If you don't like how it looks, you can wipe it off and do it again. It's very easy to work with these paints. Or again, if you're using your pre-made product, it works the same way. For blending, I really like these types of brushes here. This is a 1/8 inch angular shader. So it's a little stumpy, soft brush. It's already been used a little bit, so it's a little bit frayed at the end, but it still works as well for the blending effects. And we'll just start blending. If you need a little bit of thinner, you can use that, but often you can get away with just blending it because the paint has such a slow drying time. It'll just kind of move around and let you blend it out or leave it where you want it. Can make that a little bit more smooth maybe, but it's getting there. There we go, we got some dust on the panel there. Pretty easy. And you can also note that the whole panel itself has also taken a slightly different color, like a filter. Again, it's all the same thing in the end, just different colors to simulate fading or dust or dirt. But the techniques and the approach is often the same. You can also do that where I've got my darker color accumulated around this corner here to make some darker dust there. Often I'd use both back and forth to make like darker areas and then lighter areas beside that to make the darker area look like a accumulated wet spot. And then for the dots I applied here, The dot filter, usually you would get a little bit of thinner on your brush, just a little bit. And then you streak it down to make some streaking effects. So just a little bit of thinner on this guy. And then you just want to catch it and blend it down. Usually you want to do some downward motions to simulate the path of rain and everything. You can see it's blended out a little bit there, and you can just go a little bit further. And just keep blending it until it's, you know, whatever little hint of streaking effect is still remaining to your liking. You can also use different colors, like I've got oranges and yellows and greens. And instead of making dust streaking effects, this will make some kind of variation, make the paint look faded, for example. Same effect, same execution, just different colors. And maybe we'll do some more oil blending in the yellow area. So I'll pick between these two panels here, and we'll make a little bit of more oil paint accumulation to simulate some grime or some mud or anything. Again, if you're doing any of these pre-made effects, it's the same. You just apply a little bit of it from the bottle. It'll be a little bit of like a thick wash consistency like this. It might flow a little bit, but you can always scoop off the heavier stuff from the bottom of the bottle. And then we can just blend it out and leave it in like the crevices and stuff. There we go. You can work more on it to make it more to your liking because you have many hours before it dries permanently. But just like that, we've got some nice accumulations of grime between those two panels. Now back to the wash I applied just a minute ago. You can see around this bolt there, whatever that is, I wasn't very precise and I got a little bit of excess around the bolt where it shouldn't be. It should be all in the shadow around it, but there's some on the flat panel next to it. Again, a benefit of using oil paints or enamel washes here is that you just get a little bit of your enamel thinner. I'm using this stuff. And you just wipe away the stuff you don't like. Because it dries over the course of a few hours. You have lots of time to adjust it and clean up any excess you don't like. And this won't harm my base paints because they're like a lacquer-based paint or acrylic-based paint, and there's been a varnish applied to protect them.
Any questions? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Go on.
So for armored vehicles,
Yes.
Is there any difference in the effects you would apply to vertical surfaces versus flat horizontal surfaces? You
Yeah.
use some stuff on one, but not on the other, and so on?
I would use the same products, but I would use different effects. I'll use my tank here as an example. On the upper surfaces, when I did what I just showed there with that oil paint blending between those two panels, I do a whole bunch of that, and I kind of make sure that the paint's collecting around crevices where it would just end up as the crew kicks it around, they walk around. So a lot of that grime is, you know, maybe you can see that around the edge of where this edge is, I guess, where this gun sight moves back and forth. But on the horizontal or the vertical surfaces on the sides, I don't make the accumulations. Instead, I do those streaking effects. So you can probably see some streaking effects here where there's some dust kind of coming down from the hatch. And of course, there's also some streaking effects down in here where I've speckled it on a little bit and then blended it down. So for speckling, what I did was, instead of applying little dots, I got a little bit of the paint in my brush and I flick it with a toothpick, and little tiny specks go on the model, which gives you fine dots, and then you just blend them out exactly as I did those dots I applied over here, and I blended those down. I did that on the sides of the vehicle, and it gives you some little specks and some streaking effects when you blend it down. All right, I guess we'll wrap it up now. So there we go, a quick demo of the effects that we discussed, the primary ones, which is some chipping effects, dry brushing maybe, some washes, and a little bit of accumulation of dirt in the corners. Hopefully that was enjoyable and maybe helped clear up some of the mystery of all these different brands and products and what you're supposed to use them for, what they're meant for. Of course, you can use anything however you want, but like filters and washes and dust effects, streaking effects, it can all be confusing, but hopefully this helped to clear up some of that. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you have any questions, you can post them in the comment section, and Bill or I will get back to you. And thank you for having me, Bill. It was a pleasure to do a demo as always here.
Thank you.
Alrighty.
Proud of two. Okay, don't forget, please subscribe, slap that bell, hit that like button, and join Team Hobby Center.